G'day and welcome to another instalment on our MC19 project. So far what we have is a running engine that seems to be in absolutely pearling condition. We have a tank that has been painted. We have a fairing kit, but sadly that will be the last thing that you guys will see probably. We've painted a subframe. What we need to start looking at is wheels and suspension. Now, one of the things that we need to look at, of course, is the steering. There's a bearing at the base of the triple clamp and one at the top. So those bearings on this particular bike are actually in pretty good condition. They're very smooth. When I move the wheel, when I move the handlebars, I can feel that they're very smooth. They feel that the bars are easy to move, but when I go and grab the fork and try and get that to wiggle, there isn't a great deal going on there. So what we're actually looking at, this is your triple clamp, this little bit here, and there is a bearing there, and there is another one up the top there. Now they can be either loose ball bearings or they can be a cage bearing. And as I said before, you can see this is moving nice and easy. But when we start wiggling, we can't see any movement in here. So I'm disinclined to do anything with these guys. Remember, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And on this bike, there's enough things that are broke as it is, including me. I will go broke getting this thing on the road. Now the next thing we look at is the fork seals. Now this is a dust seal up the top here, and that is definitely hard. It's been prized off before by somebody who was not particularly gentle with it, and it's such an effective seal that it's full of water in there. So I'm not particularly impressed. The thing with these seals is that if the bike is stationary for a long time, these seals will harden up. So if they don't leak today, they will leak eventually. It happened to the Sparta project. Chances are it will happen to this one. While we have the bike dismantled, this is the best opportunity to rectify the problem. What I find as well is that the suspension is not particularly firm. So in the very least, the fork oil is probably not in the best state. It could be the original Honda fork oil, 32-year-old oil. Think of that. Also, over a period of time, you will lose fork oil. It does get past that seal. That's generally not a problem until the bike gets a lot of mileage on it. And there's even a drain plug on some forks so that you can just simply change it. If we're going to change fork seals, and we need in the very least to get rid of this dust seal anyway, so we may as well keep going, then we're going to change the fork oil anyway, and we'll take an opportunity if we can get a measurement for it. We will also have a look at the spring free length. and decide if they need packing up or replacing if they're in bad enough state. We need to take a look at the brakes as well. Now, hopefully you can hear this. Now that shing noise, that is actually fairly normal. That's the pads rubbing against the disc. There's a few clunks in there that I can hear that I'm not a fan of. So it's well worth us checking out the wheel bearings as well. So on the subject of brake, I've put a brake lever on this master cylinder and I've tried to bleed it, and the master cylinder is completely shot. So inside there is a rubber cup or a rubber seal, and that simply is not sealing in any way, shape or form, so it's not able to pump brake fluid into the disc. So the disc is a bit of an unknown. The master cylinder, the brake caliper is a bit of an unknown. The master cylinder is definitely a write-off. We can left shoulder that or kit that. I'm inclined to left shoulder them because when you get to the point where the piston inside there, that rubber cup or the rubber seal, the moment that is worn, then you've probably got the bore that it runs in, which is in there. That bore is probably going to be a bit bell-shaped as well. It's not going to be completely cylindrical anymore. It's going to be something else, like a shape of a bell, if you can picture that, where the sides are not parallel to each other. In the middle it bulges out slightly, and it only needs to do that a few thousandths of an inch for it to become unserviceable. So, where we need to start is probably to take this caliper off, which is not rocket science, and then rotate the wheel again, and we'll listen for that clicking noise, and that's going to tell us if the bearings are no good. When we take the wheel off, we're going to check the bearings anyway. You can feel them with your hands. When they're in a bad state, it's actually fairly obvious that the bearing is no good. From there we'll decide whether or not we want to replace them. They're quite cheap, the bearings. They're very simple and easy to obtain, so it doesn't hurt to replace them anyway. If you've got a shadow of doubt, or you just feel like being proactive, with 50,000 kilometres on the clock from memory, they're not going to be sparklingly brand new. However, they should be serviceable. 50,000 is not a massive amount for a wheel bearing, not on a bike. So we're going to remove the brake caliper, but because we have to replace the master cylinder anyway, we may as well take some steps to sort of make our lives hopefully less messy, but definitely easier. So what we might start by doing is removing the master cylinder and the lever, cracking the brake line, and then taking the caliper off. So all of this stuff needs attention at some level. So under here there's just a bracket. We'll start by removing. Simply holds brake line onto the triple clamp. And we've got another bracket down here. Performs the same task. Think in a forward direction. Now what I'm going to do is just loosen that. I'm not taking it off, I'm just loosening it. That would be the brake line goes onto an olive connector here, and you want to take that off eventually, but it's easier to loosen it off now. Ooh. Taking off here, even though you can't see it, it's just the two 8mm headed bolts that hold the whole shebang on. I'm going to pop them on there so that they're not lost. Then you've got two wires that go to the stoplight switch. I'm just going to slip those off. So far so good. Now for the tricky part. We loosen this off, remember? There we go. Not pictured by my feet is an oil drain pan, which has now come into view. Okay, to take our caliper off, it's just those two there. Now they're 12s, I think. Yep. Go. And the reason why we did everything in that order is because any brake fluid that's remaining in this setup is now draining straight into that oil pan. We don't want brake fluid on paint wherever possible. I'm not so worried about this front guard, I'm going to replace it, but the rest of the bike I really don't need a corrosive like brake fluid on it because it will cause problems down the track. Probably the first time that those calipers have moved in, those pistons in the caliper have moved in a long time. there's our front brake pads, and they're somewhat worn, so they're going to get some replacement as well. Oh, nice. Probably can't see the two brake pistons there. Piston calipers, almost impressive. You know, I wouldn't expect any less from Honda. Oh, and they're pretty solid. We should be able to pull these pads out now and have a bit of a look at them. Fit there. Just move that one side slightly. Give us a bit of space. So that one's definitely worn. These pads are quite thin. I mean, they're serviceable, but it'd get back to that thing. While we're here, we may as well do something about this stuff. Okay. Now the big question is, do our noises stop? And they do. It just wants to keep on going, doesn't it? Good balance in the tyre. Okay, so our next thing is the speedometer drive cable. So that's just a Phillips head screw holding that plastic clip that always breaks when they get old. Back on the wheel where it won't get lost. I think we should look at taking this wheel off. We'll start by loosening these guys off. clamped down onto the axle, so you need to make sure that they're easily able to be moved by your fingers before we start hammering away at axles. Oh. Wow. Tough little devils. So you loosen one off, and then the body of the fork will expand against the other one. So all four of those are done now. That looks like about 24. Yes, not bad for an old guy. And just make a mental note of where this little guy is sitting. There seems to be a line scribed around him if you have a close look. And we go to reinstall. Need to make sure that the axle goes back in the right place. You should never use your hands as hammers like that. This actually kills the nerve endings in them. Guessing that's still pretty tight. Might have to find a grip. This is actually an old extension bar. That all should be looser than it currently is. Like that. Just taking the pressure off it was all that was required. And there we have the front wheel. So all I've done there is made sure all the spaces were facing the original way. And put the bolt back on the bolt back on the end of it, and we'll come back to this. Okay, so moving along. Want to get this front guard off. And with the wheel off, that's going to be very easy. Sorry folks. Actually see traces of oil there too. I think doing these fork seals is starting to become a really good idea. Now we do have a new guard, and we might actually need this metal part inside. It wouldn't surprise me if we do. But for now, just follow the practice of putting the bolts back into their threads. What I am liking about this bike, by the way, is the fact that the paint on the forks is quite good for its age. Little wang there. Somewhat curious as to what's under this dust seal. Oh, talk about old little dust seals. And that's actually water from when I washed it, but it's boiling water. Okay, we're definitely having some good clean fun today, aren't we? Now, we're just removing the rubber caps. How rare is that, to have the rubber caps still on the tops of the forks? I'm impressed. Sort of supports the theory that this thing got wanged up pretty early in its life in Australia. Now what we might do is actually usually there's a circlip on the top of these guys. I'm not 100% sure. As always, we're winging it. Right, so we're actually going to crack the... That, by the way, is a 17mm. Well, we used to call them Allen wrenches, but apparently that's copyrighted, so we have to call them hex wrenches instead. Now the bike is on a centre stand, incredibly stable. Oh, that's one. We're loosening these guys off so they'll come off easier when we need to take them off. Introducing Lexa, our guard dog. Somebody once said to me, well, guard dogs are easy to fix. Just give it a piece of meat. And I had to point out that the dog even bites me. And any piece of meat is acceptable as long as it's connected to you. Okay, so just to show you what we're doing here, on the other side of this is another one of these hex wrench goodies. We've got one here as well. So that should have loosened off the clip-on bar. Usually there's a circlip up the top here, so what we have to do is loosen the fork up off and lift it up. So yet another of these hex wrench type cap head screws, and that looks like a 14. Oh. And there's our, there's a groove for the circlip. I don't know, she just slides up and off. That's a little odd. I'll check a parts diagram on that later. And that's one fork. Just going to do the same on the other side. And that's the other fork. Now, we're going to make our lives a little bit easier by draining these forks. Throw that away. That is a circlip groove there. I think we have a missing circlip. Interesting. We'll find out. Somewhere out there is somebody watching this video going, well, mine had a circlip, in which case, don't lose it. When you take this cap off, in there is a fairly powerful spring, and the results of taking these caps off can get really interesting, to say the least. The better the condition the springs are in, the more interesting the result can be. So proceed with caution and be prepared for the thing to spring up. There we go. Alright, those who've seen our Sparta project would remember that it was built up with washers. So we don't have that joy with this one. Ooh. There she goes. That was sitting on top of the spring by the looks of things. I want to leave the springs in there at this point. One set. And we'll go on top of our springs. Okay, that makes sense. Both those spaces are identical. Okay, that's all forklift. That is old. You guys can see that there. That's old and dodgy. This side, however, is the side that I was saying there was oily water trapped underneath the dust seal. And now we can see why. So I'm guessing that this one was periodically topped up. at the office. So with these forks, I'm going to let them sit and drain for a while. Now, you might have noticed that I was pumping them to try and clear the oil out of the drive mechanism. And I've lifted it up because there's oil now in the bottom of our container here. And if I was just to leave that down at level, it would actually start sucking up oil. So I picked it up slightly so that the end of the tube is above that level, but the spring is still in place, so to speak. Now our bike is going to sit here like this for a little while we sort all of this stuff out. That looks pretty precarious, and it did rock a bit when I was yanking on the spanners, but at the end of the day it's up there and it's going to stay there. I really do recommend investing in one of these motorcycle lifts. It was probably one of the best things that I ever added to my workshop, and they're not all that expensive. Shop around, avoid the cheaper ones. I'm not saying go out and spend $500, but if you see one for $59, it's not going to be perhaps as good as a $150 or $200 one. If you buy it online, then your price is your only real guide, and it's load rating. This one is rated something like 500 kilos, I think. Here we go, yeah, maximum load 500 kilos, and it's pretty solid. So use the load rating as its guide. Obviously, this bike 160 kilos, so 160 kilos workload is sort of the minimum you want to be shooting at. But you know, there are some sub $200 ones that are really good, and there are some really cheap, dodgy ones that you need to avoid. This is a safety item, and treat it as such. If that bike falls over, it's going to damage it. You don't want that. If you're underneath it when it falls over, then it's going to damage you, and you don't want that either. Okay.